and that frequency was.
This is part 2 of PEMF, electroporation, and COVID-19. Now we're going to go into the science of PEMF. We're going to go through the information step by step, and each principle will build on top of each other, and this will help us understand the big picture of how PEMF works. The first thing that we're going to look at is how electrons work. So up on the screen we have a battery and a light bulb. You can see how the electrons leave the negative side of the battery to the light bulb and back to the positive side of the battery. There's a YouTube channel called Into the Ordinary. They did a video called What is Electricity? Electricity Explained. If you're curious how atoms are negatively and positively charged and how that creates electrical current, I would recommend watching this video. Just know that atoms, depending on how many electrons they have, they will either have a positive charge or negative charge. And just like magnets, positive and negative charges attract each other. Another part of science that we're going to talk about is resonant inductive coupling. Resonant inductive coupling is used for wireless power systems, such as portable computers, phones, and vehicles. Alright, so how does this work? I'm going to use a visual to help us understand this. I found a YouTube video called How Wireless Energy Transfer Works.
Run an electric current through a coil of copper wire, and the coil will produce a short-range magnetic field. Place a second coil within this field, and an electric current will flow through it. The magnetic field has transferred electrical power from one coil to the other. This principle is called induction, and it has been understood for more than a century. Induction is what charges a wireless electric toothbrush, for example, and it works well over extremely short distances. Pull the coils apart, and the power transfer ceases. It turns out that the trick to longer distance power transfer is the same principle an opera singer uses to shatter a wine glass from across the room. It's called resonance. For the opera singer, when the frequency of the sound wave matches the unique resonant frequency of a glass, the acoustic energy is converted to kinetic energy at the highest possible efficiency. The energy then builds inside the glass until it shatters. The coils that Witricity uses to transfer power wirelessly are magnetic resonators. First, a rapidly oscillating electric current is applied to a coil at its specific resonant frequency. This creates a magnetic field in the region around the coil. Tune a second coil to the same resonant frequency as the source, and it will couple, resonating anywhere within that region and converting the oscillating magnetic field into an electrical current within the second coil. This response is called highly coupled magnetic resonance. By attaching the second coil to a device, such as the battery of an electric car or a mobile phone, this current can be made to do useful work. The source can be either centimeters or meters away from the device being powered and can deliver power through walls or around metal obstacles. The power can even be distributed across multiple devices at once. So by a simple trick of physics, power is transferred wirelessly.
This is all really cool technology. Here's a guy that made 2 coils and is using the same principle of resonant frequency coupling to light this light bulb. Okay, so far we've talked about some interesting things. Electrons being positively charged and negatively charged. We've talked about wireless energy transfer. All these principles of science have something in common, but to make sense of all this, we need to talk about the anatomy and the physiology of human cells. And there's no better place to learn about this than from a doctor who teaches anatomy and physiology. Now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ren.
Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung and this is my channel. I've been studying the human body from a scientific medical perspective for over 20 years and I've been teaching about the human body for over 10 years.
After looking around on the internet, I found that Dr. Ren did the best in explaining scientific principles in a simple way where I could understand, and I think you will too. There's a lot that we could learn about a cell, but the part that we want to study is the membrane potential. And here's the video that I'd like to show you.
So what is membrane potential? This drawing is supposed to represent a cell, a human cell. When we're talking about membrane potentials, here's the basics of what we mean. There's a charge across this outside membrane, a literal electrical charge. To understand the basics of how this kind of charge difference works, a good first step is to make sure you understand how the cell membrane is made up. So let's take a quick look at the structure of the cell membrane. If I took a little piece of the cell membrane and blew it up a lot, this is what we think we would see. Phosphate head group, lipid tails, and if I kept drawing this thousands and thousands of times, you could imagine that I could go all around my cell membrane here. That's what this is made out of. But of course, we don't draw it that way because doing that would take forever. What this creates in terms of a barrier, in terms of a semi-permeable barrier, that creates a lipid barrier. These tails hanging out with each other creates a lipid barrier. Particles that are polar or charged, they can't get through this barrier easily. Proteins are required in the membrane to allow things like this to pass through. So for example, the two major ions for membrane potential, sodium and potassium, this cell membrane, if it was only made out of phospholipids, these guys wouldn't be able to get through. They'd just bounce right off and they'd stay either outside the cell or inside of the cell. They wouldn't be able to pass across this membrane. Remember I said that in order for these guys to get through, there need to be proteins? The two major proteins for setting up membrane potential. The first one is called the sodium-potassium pump. It literally pumps sodium and potassium across the membrane. In order to do that, it requires energy, and of course the energy currency inside of the cell is ATP, turning it from adenosine triphosphate into adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. The energy from removing that phosphate group is used to do this, to pump out 3 sodiums, and at the same time to pump in 2 potassiums.
Here's an animation of the sodium-potassium pump. So the sodium is being pumped out, the potassium is being pumped in, and the fuel for this pump is ATP, just like any pump that you might use in your house. You need some kind of fuel, like gas or electricity, to run a pump.
This creates a difference in concentration, of course, of sodium on the outside of the cell and potassium on the inside of the cell. Just in terms of our accounting of charges, notice that this sodium-potassium pump has pumped out 3 positive charges, and while it has pumped in positive charges as well, it's only pumped in 2 positive charges. So we already have more positive charge on the outside, less positive charge on the inside. We've got a piece of the negativity going on here. This next protein is called the potassium leak channel, and it does exactly what its name says. It literally allows potassium to leak out. Remember, that's what we were pumping in over here. The sodium-potassium pump pumped out some positive charge. It pumped out more positive charge than it pumped in. And now those positive charges that the sodium-potassium pump pumped in, we're allowing some of those to get out, thus increasing even more the positive charge on the outside and decreasing the positive charge or increasing the negative charges on the inside.
Something I'd like to mention here is the chloride ion. It's negatively charged, and because the sodium and potassium are either being pumped out or leaked out, chloride ion, negative ion, is staying inside the cell. So now we have that potential energy between the inside and the outside of the cell. And this brings us to the next topic of action potential.
Here's what basically happens, and I'll do it on the cell first. During an action potential, some kind of stimulus comes and causes this to happen. The outside becomes negative, the inside becomes positive, and then right after that, very, very quickly after that, we go back to resting. So that's it. That is an action potential. The charge flips and then flips right back again. On my graph, it looks something like this. Some kind of stimulus comes, and that stimulus is basically from somewhere positive charge enters the cell, enough positive charge to cause this negative charge to approach this dashed line. That is what's called threshold. The importance of that, once we reach threshold, there are proteins in this membrane that are going to take care of the rest of it. They're going to flip the charge and flip it back again. And I'll get to those in a little bit. Once we reach threshold, then those proteins in the membrane cause the voltage to go way up to around plus 30 millivolts, and then immediately the charge comes back down and actually becomes more negative than it was at rest, and then we get back to resting potential again. So if we represent an action potential on a graph such as this one, it looks something like this. Let's talk about what happens when we reach threshold, and for that I'm going to change my picture slightly, and I'm going to include the proteins of action potential. Here's my first protein, and then here's my second protein. So once we reach threshold, what causes the membrane to go positive? The membrane goes positive because this first channel, the voltage-gated sodium channel, opens in response to that reaching of threshold. That causes sodium to come into the cell. Sodium is positively charged, so the charge on the membrane, on the inside, the charge goes up, the positive charge goes up. So once we reach threshold, those voltage-gated sodium channels open and we get depolarization. This increase of charge, going a lot more positive. And here's what's going to happen. Once we reach this peak of around plus 30, this inhibition gate comes into play, and the channel is inhibited. No more sodium gets to come in. So that's why we only get up to plus 30. We don't go any more positive than that, and now we can come back down again. This is a voltage-gated potassium channel, and this one was also signaled to open once we reach threshold, but apparently it takes it just a little bit more time to open than the sodium channel, than the voltage-gated sodium channel takes to open. So this one opens at any rate, and remember that potassium is at a higher concentration on the inside of the cell, so when this gate opens, the potassium diffuses out of the cell. Potassium diffuses quickly out of the cell. That's going to cause the voltage inside of the cell to become more negative because we're losing positive charges. So the membrane potential becomes more negative. Remember that these channels were a little bit slower than the sodium channels. Once we get below threshold, both of these channels are signaled to close again. But we end up being a little bit hyperpolarized here, more negative than we were at rest, because the potassium channel apparently takes a little bit of time to close. So if I take it down here below threshold, we basically go back to the state that these channels were in before we started.
Let's recap with what we learned. So we've got the sodium-potassium voltage-gated channels. When they reach threshold, they both open. The potassium gate opens slower than the sodium, so a lot more sodium's coming in at first, peaking up at 30 millivolts, and then when the potassium gate opens, all the potassium goes out to equalize inside the cell. So this is the bare bones of action potential of our cells. It plays a huge part in the health of our cells and the communication, as well as contraction of muscles, secretion of hormones. This is like the breath of life in a cellular level. And if we're going to understand pulse electromagnetic field therapy, we have to understand this part of our body, the physiology of action potential. Please stay tuned, stay with me, guys. I know this is a lot of information, but in the end, it will all make sense. It will all come together. You cannot understand PEMF unless you know about these essential principles of science and biology.
The only certain barrier to truth is the belief that you already have it. Voltaire. What if this world and everything we think about reality turned out to be very different to what we believe it to be? It's a question that very much upsets a lot of people. The evidence that I discussed recently of ancient technology, free energy devices, the fact that it seems that free energy was very readily available a couple of centuries ago anyway. I find all of this stuff incredibly interesting and intriguing, looking into the concept of ancient technology and technology that's very different from the technology we use now, such as sound frequency technology. I've seen a lot of reports recently talking about the organs, the old pipe organs, and what these were really used for, whether they are in fact instruments that were used to create sound frequency that we used for healing. And this may sound preposterous to a lot of people, but these pipe organs in these cities and these small towns, it seems like every town has one as well. I've even got reports from little villages in Mexico that don't have very much there. They've got dirt roads and all sorts of stuff, but there'll be a church in the town which has a huge pipe organ. They don't really know where it came from, but it's there. And the question is, what was the real purpose of these instruments? Were they merely for creating music, or was it really a sound healing system that they had? And Royal Raymond Rife was a man who found a way to cure all diseases way back in the 20s or 30s. I think it was in the 1930s or the 1940s, they actually had a banquet to celebrate the end of all disease due to the research and techniques that had been uncovered by Royal Raymond Rife, and he was curing incurable diseases, and he did it through sound frequency. He was able to identify viruses, live viruses in the body. He could view them with this microscope that he built. The Rife microscope was an absolutely incredible device which gave him the ability to be able to view viruses in real time. And what he would do, he would put a blood sample under the microscope, and he would look at your blood sample, and he would subject the sample to a series of light frequencies. Because every light you apply, when you go through frequencies of light and you put them on an object, different frequencies of light will illuminate different aspects of the object. Like if you put frequencies of light on a blood slide, different organisms or viruses or bacteria in the blood will become illuminated under certain lights. And Rife figured out that all you have to do is go through the light frequency until you find the light that illuminates the virus, and then find the corresponding sound frequency, bombard the virus with that sound frequency, and it will shatter like a crystal glass shatters on high C. When an opera singer hits high C, they can shatter a crystal glass. It's the same thing, it's the same principle. All you have to do is find the corresponding sound frequency, and you will create a feedback loop which will shatter the virus. And that's what Royal Rife figured out. So when you look at that, and you think of these organs and the sound that they produce and the healing that comes from sound, I mean, any people who've gone to sound healings know what I'm talking about, and sound healings may sound incredibly new age and airy-fairy to most people, but they do in fact work. And I find all of this sort of stuff quite intriguing and quite fascinating. And the concept that we had this ancient technology is really not so far-fetched. And when you think about it and you really consider the possibility that this technology has been stolen from us, it really does provide a whole new perspective to look at things from. And you think about these huge pipe organs in these churches, folks. Who built these things? I mean, these things are amazing, the construction of them. Some of them are absolutely huge. Who figured out the frequencies and who got it all that perfect? Who tuned it? And imagine the sound field that it would set up if you went through the entire keyboard and you created that level of sound. I mean, these things are incredibly loud. You could literally cover the entire village in a sound frequency. What if people went to these church buildings and they actually sat in the organ music, and the organ music healed them of all of the bacteria in their body every week when they went to these churches? Perhaps the churches were not places of worship, perhaps they were places of healing. Just a thought. Look at the detail of these organs, look at the detail that went into the construction of them, the meticulous workmanship of them. Look at the detail that went into the construction of a lot of these buildings. Like I said last week, and like I've said quite often recently, a lot of these buildings look more like machines than actual buildings. They look like they're buildings that actually perform a function, which isn't just an aesthetic function of looking good or being a place to pray in. They very much look like they are able to accumulate and harness and use energy in a way that we are unaware of. And when you begin to consider these type of things, even if you don't want to believe them, just considering them, it does open up a whole new train of thought for people. And if you can really consider this type of technology being a reality, then look at the type of technology we use now. Look at the 5G system. Look at all of this digital stuff that we're doing, which is so different to this analog technology that we were using. Anybody who knows the human vessel and understands humanity understands the difference between analog and digital and how it affects us on an emotional and on an energetic level. I mean, it does. I mean, we're very much analog in everything we do, and even that is not the probably correct way to say it, but the whole digital realm that we're being led into now, it's completely the opposite of any of this ancient type of technology we're using. Even the explosive type of electricity that we create through burning coal and all the things that we do to create electricity, if there was a way to simply do it through harmonizing with the ether around us, it would seem to be far more beneficial. I mean, just think about it, folks. You know, we're made of energy. The static electricity that is around everywhere is part of us. It's part of everything. If you're a kid, you probably had a crystal set when you were a kid, a crystal radio set. I had one when I was a child. You just combine these crystals and they harvest energy from the field, and bang, you've got electricity, you've got a radio. So why do you need to have these big coal-fired power stations? You know, if you had crystals and copper and metal and wires and put it in the right configuration, why would you not be able to harvest energy from the field? I mean, if you can do it with a crystal radio set, why can't you do it with a huge building and create an energy field which is going to work for everybody? Makes sense to me. It's just that a lot of people aren't prepared to think that way. You know, they see their crystal radio sets they had as a kid as something novel, but apply it on a bigger scale. Look at what you use to make that crystal radio set. You use crystals, you use copper wire, you used all the things that we find in these buildings. But where does it all lead, all of this type of discussion? That's the question, isn't it? I mean, with the rollout of 5G and all of the stuff that's happening, some people may ask, what is the point of looking down these rabbit holes and discussing what may have happened in the past? Well, the point is that This past is so recent. It's not thousands of years ago, it's just hundreds of years ago. And I've tried so many ways of awakening people. I've pointed out the clear and present danger that we're in. I've pointed out the state of urgency that we're in. I've addressed 9/11. I've addressed the state of Israel. I've addressed the war on terror. I've addressed every single thing I can think of to attempt to awaken people and to empower people. And the concept that we had free energy as little as 150 to 200 years ago, and we lived in a completely different society, I find incredibly empowering. And if people can grasp this concept and see how recently it really was, that we were very likely in much freer societies than we are now, it may inspire them to want to get back to that. We've got remnants of this culture still here all over the earth. These big copper top buildings, these big churches, these spires, all these things that we can't build now. Even the pipe organs that I was talking about before. You go and find someone who can go and build one of these pipe organs for you. See if you can find someone. See if you can find a church that's even using one of these pipe organs now. Most churches, they may have a pipe organ in there, but it's rarely used. And if it is used, it's just used to play hymns. You think they would really go to all the trouble of constructing an organ of this size and shape and magnitude of some of the ones that you see in these old churches and just use them for playing tunes behind hymns on Sundays? Do you really think they would go to all that effort just to do that? It seems pretty incongruous to me. But I don't know, I find all of this type of information really empowering. Perhaps it will inspire people to actually shake the sleep from their eyes, because that's really what it's like. It's like people are walking around in a daze. All of this technology exists all around them. All of this old world, a lot of the old world still exists all around them, but they're simply not seeing it because they can't see outside of the social construct that they have in their minds. They can't see beyond the history that they've been told, the history they've been taught, the world that they've been indoctrinated into believing is real. A lot of people, when they look at society, they just view it economically. They don't view it from a human perspective. But our society should be there to support life. That should be first and foremost the absolute mandate of anything that we construct to have people living in. Any cities should be designed to support life. We don't need cities that are designed the way they are, that are designed to run economically and that are based on profit. Medical systems that are based on profit, energy systems that are based on profit. Everything is based on profit. It's this introduction of money and thus scarcity over the human experience which creates all of this substandard culture that we've got, all these substandard products. It removes us of everything that it means to be human by imposing this economic model over people. That's what it's been for. That's what it's been designed to do. And that's why we can never escape this system until we put all of that thinking down. If people still think economically, if people still think that this society is normal, that it should function this way, that we need to do the things that we're doing, then there's no hope for us. If we're going to continue to support these cities that we live in, which are designed to separate people and to make them completely dependent upon the system. You can't grow your own food. You can't ever survive on your own in a city. It's a jungle, and it's designed to be that way, both physically and mentally. Everything about the cities is jungle mentality. Survival of the fittest. Only the things that you need for you to survive are not there. Unless you can exploit someone else and get the paper you need to pay to be alive to go and buy these things from some establishment, there's nothing there in your environment that you can actually use to create a life for yourself. It's all economically based. It's simply not the natural habitat of humans. Humans shouldn't be living in these cities. They don't serve us in any way, shape or form. And if you look at the way cities were constructed back in the past cultures, they very much seem to be designed in a way that would serve the people and that would benefit the people, even possibly heal the people, as we've just been previously discussing. Now you look at all this stuff and you see just what we had and just what we are capable of doing. And I don't know, I find it incredibly empowering to think about this. And I find it inspiring, I find it healing. And I think this type of information may be something that will wake people up. So